Hey everybody, I wanted to do something called, I don't know, second pass or something like that about the sermons, because one of the things that I've realized is that we're cruising through Mark's gospel and there's a ton of stuff that I'm just not talking about. And some of that stuff are the things that are kind of deeper Bible teaching that I think people would like to know about, would like to know it's in the passage, because they might not have the expertise to know it's there, or it might be confusing. So I'd like to do some videos that come after my sermon, some of the stuff that ended up on the cutting room floor and I didn't get to include in the message, that if you want to know more, you can know. It'll all be Bible teaching. Here's what these passages mean, mostly. And I'm hoping it'll be helpful, so here goes. I want to go back about 3 sermons to the place where Jesus talked about cutting off your hand or your eye, or gouging out your eye or whatever, because I think that passage is difficult for some people to get. So let me read it in the New International Version, and then let me explain why I think it's helpful to know some more about it. So this is Mark's Gospel, chapter 9, verse 42. I'm starting. Jesus said, if anyone causes one of these little ones who believes in me to sin, it would be better for him to be thrown into the sea with a large millstone tied around his neck. And if your hand causes you to sin, cut it off. It's better for you to enter life maimed than with 2 hands go to hell, where the fire never goes out. And if your foot causes you to sin, cut it off. It is better for you to enter life crippled than to have 2 feet and be thrown into hell. And if your eye causes you to sin, pluck it out. It's better for you to enter the kingdom of God with 1 eye than to have 2 eyes and be thrown into hell, where the worm does not die and the fire is not quenched. Everyone will be salted with fire. So part of the issue, there's essentially 2 issues here. One is what essentially looks like hyperbole. I mean, does Jesus really want us to gouge out our eyes if we look at girls too long? Or does he want us to really saw off our legs if we know we're going to use them to take us to the wrong place? You know what I mean? So I think that's an important question. And then the second one is, it sounds here like what Jesus is saying is, if you sin, you go to hell. And that really creates an issue when we believe we're saved by faith through the grace that Jesus purchased for us on the cross. And so when he says, if you sin, do this or do that, one of the reasons why it's important is that the translation of this passage is kind of difficult. But let me point out a couple of things that I think might be helpful. If you start in verse 42, it says, if anyone causes one of these little ones who believes in me to sin, it would be better for him to be thrown into the sea with a large millstone tied around his neck. Now, what that sounds like it's saying in that English translation is, if you do anything to cause a kid to sin, a kid that believes in Jesus to sin, it'd be better you'd be drowned with a big rock tied around your neck. Not particularly nice. But when you look at that verse in the original language, in verse 42, it says, and also whoever offends one of these little ones. And the word that's used there in Greek is the word scandalizo, or it's scandalise in that form. And it's the word we get, it's the Greek word we get the English word scandal from. And so there was a word that was used by Christians for a while called to scandalize somebody. I don't know if you've ever heard anybody say that. But to scandalize someone essentially means to offend them so badly that they're completely turned off towards a particular subject or person permanently. So if you scandalize somebody in relationship to the National Baseball League, right? That is, if there's a hockey or baseball strike, and the player strike is so offensive, like we have an NFL strike right now. It's possible for some people to be so offended by that they're just never going to watch football again. Now, it's a little irrational, but you get those things. Or somebody goes to a church and somebody does something to them that causes them, at least somewhat legitimately, to just never go there again. They're scandalized. It's not that their feelings are hurt only, but something that we do or something that you do drives somebody away from something irrevocably. And that's really the meaning of the word scandalize. There's lots of other Greek words for sin. Hamartia is the one that's most commonly used in the New Testament. But there's a number of different words for sin, and that's not the word used here. Now, of course, obviously the New International Version authors have to pick some word to translate this with. And I wasn't in the meeting where they decided the word, and who knows, maybe no other options were as good. You can't just put scandalize in there because most people aren't going to understand that. But it's important to recognize that Jesus isn't saying, if you do anything that causes any one who believes in me to sin, you're basically going to a terrible hell. It'd be better for you to be murdered terribly. What he's saying is that if you participate in driving one of these weaker ones away from me, if you push away one of my sheep out into the wilderness where that sheep goes and dies, that's not taken lightly at all. You're going to pay for that. You can't lightly handle children or weaker saints or people who really deserve your compassion and your help. You can't just do whatever you want with them. They are not there for your using. They are my sheep, Jesus is saying. And if you scandalize them, there's going to be, rather literally, hell to pay for that. Now, I believe that people who have done this can be forgiven. But I think what Jesus is trying to get across is, as sin goes, this is incredibly serious. And you might not think doing something that caused some kid to lose their religion or some person with weaker faith to lose their faith would be a sin on par to like rape or murder or stealing or defrauding somebody or whatever. And what Jesus is saying is that this sin, the sin of scandalizing someone else, is way up there in the hierarchies of what is profoundly wicked. There's this place in the Screwtape letters where Screwtape, the underdemon, is talking with Screwtape, the older, more mature demon tempter, and they're talking about sexual temptation. Well, they're actually talking about love and different theories, and Screwtape's talking about how you can destroy people with love in lots of different ways. Romantic love he's talking about. And Screwtape asks him, well, is it good or bad? And Screwtape goes, that's the kind of question we would expect the humans to ask. Don't you see? Nothing matters except what causes somebody to move either closer to God or further away from him. Ultimately, that's the bottom line of what matters. Whether God's created creatures are moving more towards him or more away from him. And so if you can use romantic love to make somebody prideful and move them away from God, who cares if they like it or if in some other ways it's good? The point is, are they moving into the orbit of their Creator and Redeemer or out of the orbit of their Creator and Redeemer? And that's essentially what Jesus is saying here. What matters is not necessarily whether or not a person sins, but whether or not they're scandalized, whether or not you have thrust somebody out of the orbit of their Creator and Redeemer or are bringing them into it. And as this passage develops and it talks about us cutting off our hand, gouging out our eye, sawing off our leg, the same word keeps getting used. If your hand causes you to sin, same word, scandalize, scandalizon. That word for to scandalize or to drive away from the faith, what he's saying is if there's some sin related to your hand or your eye or your foot, you're not just sinning or you're not failing. It's not just a minor idea. It's a major idea. Is this taking you out of the orbit of the Savior? Is this taking you away? Is this poisoning your heart? Is this doing something to you that's going to take you away, finally and irrevocably? And if that's true, it is better to cut your leg off. Because he's saying the fire never goes out in hell. Like the consequence for it is dire. Some of you might remember a few years back, there was a hiker who got his arm caught in this crevice in a mountain, and he ended up cutting it off with like a Swiss Army knife. And people were like, well, right on, dude. I mean, it was either that or starving to death, right? You could die or you could saw off your arm with a Swiss Army knife. It's up to you. And he managed to have the guts, apparently, to do that. Jesus is saying essentially the same thing, that there are things... Now, I think that Jesus is speaking a little hyperbolically. I mean, the church has always believed that that passage isn't to be taken literally in the sense of cut off your leg, cut off your hand, gouge out your eye. In the early centuries of the church, there was a church father named Origen who actually cut off his gear, a little bit of his gear, to make sure he was absolutely pure when he was teaching catechism to young women converts. And the church condemned that. They were like, no, don't be doing that. You can't, that's not what Jesus meant there. But what Jesus is saying is you may have to take pretty radical action to shut off habitual sin that will ultimately drag you away from the gospel, away from Christ, and out of the orbit of your Creator, irrevocably scandalized away. I mean, I've asked guys who come to me to help them with pornography addictions, and I just ask them, well, how far are you willing to go? And I'll ask them the first time I meet with them oftentimes, if it comes to this, are you willing to take your computer CPU or your laptop and throw it in the lake? Are you willing to be without a smartphone? Are you willing to do what it really takes to get free of whatever sin this is? Or husbands or wives that have gotten involved with other women or other men, and they come for marriage counseling, and I say, are you really willing to do what it takes here? Are you willing to cut off the relationship? Are you willing to look for your sexual happiness and fulfillment in your spouse rather than in something else? Are you really willing to do what it's going to take? Or are you going to let this drag you away? Because the issue is not sins. That is not the issue. What God is seeking to pull us away from, and what devils are trying to drag us into, the fulcrum of temptation is not whether or not you'll sin. Because there's plenty of redemption to save you from that sin. And a sin isn't going to get you scandalized. The goal is whether or not, the goal for both sides is to pull you towards God or away from Him. Whether you'll be scandalized or whether you'll be one of the sheep. That's the issue. And the question Jesus is asking is, are you willing to do what it takes to not be scandalized? To not slowly be drained of your faith? To not slowly be pulled away? To not slowly be destroyed by the sin you won't give up? That's the question. Because He said, hell is a place the fire never goes out, where the worm never dies. Because if we're irrevocably taken away from Christ, we're out of faith, we're out of redemption, we haven't applied the cross to our life, or we've unapplied it. I mean, whatever you want to say there, the fact is we will not be under the grace of the cross, which means we didn't just sin. We missed redemption. We missed salvation. And we chose damnation. That's the issue. Whatever would cause us to be scandalized, or whatever we might do to scandalize others, Jesus is saying has to be ruthlessly abandoned and fought against. Whether related to ourselves or anybody else.